It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Mark Sainsbury to the Bucharest Russell 150 conference. I met Professor Sainsbury, I believe it's been a couple of years now, and he's always been generous with his time and his explanations. It is a pleasure to have him as a keynote here. Mark, the floor is yours, and you will be talking about Russellian acquaintance and understanding language. Please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Andre. It's very nice of you to invite me. May I share my screen?
Of course. There's a share screen green button at the bottom of the screen. Excellent.
Does that look as if it's now shared?
It's visible.
Okay. So as Andre said, this talk is called Russellian Acquaintance and Understanding Language. And of course, the notion of Russellian acquaintance has been widely studied. But I hope to have something to add to an understanding of how it fits into Russell's larger philosophy. So I'm starting with just some historical issues. If one read Russell's last philosophical publication called My Philosophical Development, one would get the impression that he was committed throughout his life to a principle of acquaintance, because he writes, "I have maintained a principle which still seems to me completely valid, to the effect that if we can understand what a sentence means, it must be composed entirely of words denoting things with which we are acquainted or definable in terms of such words." So that was 1959. And of course, the principle, I seem not to be able to advance my screen. Wait a minute. Let's try another way. So those words at the top of the slide were written in 1959, but his principle of acquaintance goes back at least to on denoting 1905 and was conspicuously deployed in knowledge by acquaintance, knowledge by description in 1910. So you might think that Russell's later remark was indeed correct. But it's interesting that in the analysis of mind, there's what appears to be a repudiation of the principle of acquaintance, which I've only recently noticed. He writes, "Understanding words does not consist in knowing their dictionary definitions or in being able to specify the objects to which they are appropriate. Understanding language is more like understanding cricket. It is a matter of habits acquired in oneself and rightly presumed in others. The use of the word comes first, and the meaning is to be distilled out of it by observation and analysis." And in a note, he quotes Rebo, somebody of whom I have to say I hadn't heard, who writes, "We learn to understand a concept as we learn to walk, dance, fence, or play a musical instrument. It is a habit." So that comes from a book, 1899, called The Evolution of General Ideas, and the digitized text is actually available in the Library of Context. I did a quick look, and I have to say that the bit that Russell quoted seemed to me the most interesting thing in the book. I'm still having trouble advancing my screen. Right. The plan for this talk is to suggest that there are serious problems in getting acquaintance to play a significant role in explaining what it is to understand language, and that we actually do better if we adopt this analysis of mind view of what understanding consists in. It's more like learning a language is more like learning to walk than it is like learning a fact or being acquainted with an object. So the principle of acquaintance, of course, needs restriction, as Russell explicitly notes in various places. it at least needs to exclude the logical constants. And he says that, he makes that fully explicit in the My Philosophical Development passage immediately after the part I quoted a couple of slides back. He writes, "It is perhaps necessary to place some limitation upon this principle of acquaintance as regards logical words." And that's not something he came to late in life, because we find that restriction in effect as early as the earliest formulation of the principle of acquaintance, because it's in on denoting. Everything, nothing, and something are not assumed to have any meaning in isolation, but a meaning is assigned to every proposition in which they occur. This is the principle of the theory of denoting I wish to advocate, that denoting phrases never have any meaning in themselves, but that every proposition in whose verbal expression they occur has a meaning. So the principle of acquaintance that he states later is restricted so as to apply only to expressions having meaning in isolation or introducing constituents into the proposition expressed. So we shouldn't think of the principle of acquaintance as an entirely general principle applying to the understanding of every expression in language, but only to understanding such expressions as have meaning in isolation. So that's going to mean roughly expressions which in some sense rather refer to or in other ways connect directly with the world. So that was a restriction of the principle. I want to expand it as well as restricting it in a way that Russell didn't, because I'll ignore Russell's restrictive view of potential objects of acquaintance and assume that any possible object of perception, as understood in a common sense way, is a possible object of acquaintance. So common sense, I'd assume, includes mountains and so on, tables and so on, as objects of perception, and actually doesn't think of sense data as an object of perception. So I want to allow that when we talk about acquaintance in connection with Russell, we can do something that Russell would have disapproved of, namely we could have regarded perfectly ordinary proper names as candidates for having a meaning which can only be grasped in virtue of acquaintance. Predicates also fall within the principle of acquaintance very explicitly in Russell, and he was fully explicit. He said that one needs acquaintance with a color in order to understand the color word for that color. But he, although that's completely explicit, it can't be gainsaid. That's in Problems of Philosophy and in Knowledge by Acquaintance, Knowledge by Description. But he doesn't really speak much about that phenomenon, which he calls acquaintance with universals. So I'm just going to follow Russell and focus mainly on proper names. And so I'll just consider the claim that understanding a name is related in some significant and important way with being acquainted with its bearer. That's a rough formulation to start with. And I'll also assume, again with Russell, that understanding is a form of knowledge. Now, it's pretty obvious that acquaintance is not sufficient for understanding, despite Russell's occasional over-optimism about that issue. So he writes in the Lectures on the Philosophy of Logical Atomism, in order to understand a name for a particular, the only thing necessary is to be acquainted with that particular. When you are acquainted with that particular, you have a full, adequate, and complete understanding of the name, and no further information is required. But that's obviously a mistake. At least assuming that only P is necessary for Q entails P is sufficient for Q, which it seems to me it does. So it's obvious that acquaintance is not sufficient for understanding. Non-linguistic creatures are acquainted with many things, but they don't understand any language by hypothesis. They're non-linguistic. And I'm acquainted with many students whose names I do not know. So acquaintance can't be sufficient, and we must just write this off as a mistake. It was just a lecture, so So let's have a plausible thesis then, that if one understands a name for an object, one is acquainted with that object. So this makes acquaintance necessary, but not sufficient. So the question I want to ask is, how does acquaintance facilitate understanding? How could we think of Russell's thesis here? So I'm going to assume that understanding is a form of knowledge, and operating within Russell's framework about knowledge, or the framework anyway of the early Russell, we've just got two options. Understanding is knowledge of things, and understanding is knowledge of truths. Those were the two kinds of knowledge that Russell allows. What I want to propose is that there's a dilemma facing the attempt to make acquaintance do serious work within a conception of understanding that requires understanding to consist either in knowledge of things or knowledge of truths. Well, it can't consist merely in knowledge of a thing. We've seen that already. In addition to knowledge of a thing, one also needs, it would seem at least, to know a relational fact. Something like understanding a name N is knowing that N refers to A, where N is a name and A refers to its bearer. But so this is what it seems you have to say if you think of understanding as knowledge of a truth. The truth would have to take the form which relates the name to an object in the world. But if you put it the way I've just put it, that presupposes that we understand A, whatever that is. It's some sort of singular concept or a singular name or something of that kind. And the dilemma is that either acquaintance does not involve anything representational, in which case it cannot contribute to knowledge of a truth. To contribute to knowledge of a truth, acquaintance would have to deliver a representation of an object, and then the truth would consist in knowing that the name refers to the object thus represented. But the other alternative is that acquaintance does involve some representation, so it can deliver something that could occur in a truth, like A in the suggestion above. But in that case, at least at first glance, a solution to the problem of nominal reference has just been taken for granted. We're assuming that acquaintance can somehow deliver a representation of an object, and then we can use that representation to deliver the relational knowledge that name stands for the object thus represented. But of course, that's not a serious contribution to understanding what it is for a name to refer to an object, because we're presupposing that acquaintance, we're just presupposing that acquaintance somehow delivers a representation which functions in that way. So you might think that, and I'm sure Russell certainly thought this at various points, the second horn of the dilemma can be resisted. So the second horn was that a solution to the problem of nominal reference has been taken for granted. This is where we think of completing the truth, knowledge of which is supposed to be what understanding a name consists in, by saying the name N refers to object A. And then the second horn was that we have to say something sensible about how the object A gets referred to, and if it's nominal reference, then we haven't advanced our inquiry. But of course, there's a very conspicuous way out for Russell, or a very conspicuous thing that Russell could say at this point. Instead of having anything nominal to complete the sentence, the name N refers to blah, 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 we should have a definite description. But then if we have a definite description, we lose any chance of getting acquaintance into the story. Or at least we certainly don't make room for the necessity of acquaintance, because then truths, knowledge of which would constitute understanding, would take the form N refers to the F. And nobody's ever supposed that you need to be acquainted with the F in order, and particularly not Russell, in order to understand the definite description, the F. So the descriptive way out, as I call it, just eliminates acquaintance from the picture. So we still face this issue. How exactly is acquaintance meant to help us understand names? The details have not yet been provided. So I think the way for a Russellian to proceed is something that Russell offers us on acquaintance. This is a quotation from that work. He says, "This is a proper name applied to the object to which I am now attending. Since I am attending to it, I can name it. I may give it any name I choose. This itself is not defined, but simply given." So I think we just need a little adjustment there. Russell is well known for not being careful about use mention. So I think the last clause should probably read, "Something is given by the word this, but the word this is not defined." And that notion of something being given by a word, that sounds promising as a way of getting acquaintance into the story. So the story would then go, you get acquainted with something which you can think of demonstratively. That's a special acquaintance-based way of getting related to an object. And this can generate knowledge of a kind that could be used to constitute linguistic understanding or generate the understanding of names. So this is a route that I'm going to explore. In addition to knowledge of truths and knowledge of things, we should consider de re knowledge. So I see the quotation at the top of the slide as Russell drawing our attention to the possibility of de re knowledge and inviting us to think that once we're in a position to have de re knowledge, then we can give the object of that knowledge any name we choose. That's because the object is given in acquaintance, and once it's available to thought, then it's nameable. So then what we would say is something like, understanding a name N is knowing concerning the referent of N that it is the referent of N. And so I think that is a good way of stating a constitutive condition on understanding a name of a kind that promises to make room for, give a significant role to acquaintance. It's a kind of hybrid of truth knowledge and thing knowledge. And the idea of having de re knowledge in the story could be justified. Consider a following standard case. Everyone in the congregation at the baptism ends up knowing the baby's name, but they may think of the baby in irrelevantly different ways. So one of them thinks of the baby as, you know, the child in the font, another of them thinks of the baby as the first son of Mary and John. But these different ways, the different ways of thinking of the baby are not relevant. They need to be abstracted from. So what you need to say is that concerning the baby, each congregant knows it is called George. So you want to attribute de re knowledge because the de re knowledge can be the same for all the participants. Intuitively, we want to say that there are different ways of thinking of the baby. Don't enter into their understanding of the name that the baby receives. So this was meant to be a way of getting a reasonable account of understanding names in a way that might make room for acquaintance, because it's natural to think of de re knowledge as Russell did in the quotation from On Acquaintance, in a way that involves acquaintance. being acquainted, we might say, makes it present to the mind. That's what Russell meant by saying it was given, the object was given. And one can acquire de re knowledge concerning an object by being acquainted with it. So acquaintance can enable the de re knowledge that is constitutive of understanding. And so the final position on this way of developing it would be that for any object x, if n refers to x, one understands it n, if and only if one knows concerning x that n refers to it. And then acquaintance comes into the story in making de re knowledge possible. That would be the thought. So how do you get acquaintance? How does acquaintance enter into Russell's picture of understanding names? On this development, the idea is that acquaintance makes de re knowledge possible, and understanding a name needs to be specified in terms of de re knowledge. But de re knowledge is possible without acquaintance, and that means that this is not going to be the kind of general result that Russell was hoping for. Think of a person or place with which you are not acquainted, for example, Aristotle. I know concerning Aristotle that he was a philosopher. I have de re knowledge without acquaintance, and we have just a ton of it. That's just one example. If you worry about that, consider you may know concerning Cairo that it's in Egypt, but if you haven't been there, then you're not acquainted with it. A huge number of the names we know permit de re attributions of knowledge, which are totally undemanding from the point of view of acquaintance. So the attempt to make acquaintance necessary for understanding by making it necessary for de re knowledge fails. That's just because things kind of go the other way around. Once you've got a name, you very likely have de re knowledge. And it's the name that is the provider of the de re knowledge rather than the de re knowledge that provides the possibility of understanding the name. So it's thanks to acquiring a name that I can have de re knowledge of what it names. So acquaintance-based theses, although I have done my best, don't seem to be true. So let me write up some theses, and then I'll consider whether they're true or not. Every successful introduction of a name involves acquaintance. So I've tried to have more plausible, sort of somewhat limited theses, not just saying that you can understand a name only if you're acquainted with its bearer, but trying for theses that have more of a chance to be true. Anyone who understands a name is acquainted with its bearer. Anyone who understands a name is either acquainted with its bearer or has learned it from someone who was acquainted with its bearer. Anyone who understands the name is either acquainted with its bearer or else knows the truth of the form, n is the f, where n alone is f. So in fact, I think all these weaker theses in which an attempt is made to specify what understanding a name involves in terms of acquaintance, I think they're all false. So I'll just give one or two counterexamples. So according to the story, Leverrier introduced the name Neptune before he'd encountered its object. He introduced it for a planet having certain causal effects on things he could observe. So he introduced a name without being acquainted with its bearer. He understood it even though he wasn't acquainted with its bearer. He understood it even though he was neither acquainted with its bearer, nor did he learn it from someone who was acquainted with its bearer, and so on. You can run through. I also like to get fictional names into the story. So philosophers of language, it seems to me, have paid insufficient attention to fictional names, and in particular to the fact that they're just like ordinary names, and one could be introduced to a name and not know whether it was a fictional name or not, and yet understand the name. So understanding a name doesn't tell you whether it's fictional or not. And that's a serious problem for anyone who wants to get acquaintance into the story. The example I gave there was an example of a name we all know to be fictional, but people give other examples of cases in which, like Atlantis, where it's not known whether this is a mythical name or a real name. Or anyway, its opinions differ about which it is. So those are fictional names, and then there are empty names like phlogiston, that was introduced thinking that it really referred to something, but the story is it didn't really refer to anything. And then you need to think of examples like the one that Kripke gave of Feynman, where somebody is said to understand the name Feynman, even though the best they can muster in the way of knowledge concerning Feynman is, well, he's a physicist or something. That's Kripke's example in naming a necessity. It's interesting, the relevant knowledge is just indefinite. There's no particular reason why that indefinite knowledge was at any rate immediately derived from anyone who was acquainted with Feynman. So I think that we do quite often acquire knowledge of meaning without acquaintance, because much the most common way to learn a new name is from someone else. We pick it up in conversation. Now, of course, there are also times in which we learn a new name by being acquainted with its bearer. The most conspicuous example is when someone introduces themselves. Hi, I'm Dave. Then you're acquainted with the bearer of the name. The name is produced. The relation between the two is made manifest. So there's no doubt that acquaintance can be involved in coming to understand a name. There are cases in which it is involved, but it's very hard to get any modal truth out of that. It's very hard to get necessarily. In some cases, you can understand a name only if you're acquainted with the bearer. Or there are some names such that necessarily you can understand them only if you're acquainted with the bearer. Any theses like that, which is the character one would expect philosophical thesis linking naming with acquaintance to have, are clearly, to my mind, they're clearly false. Anyway, many times there's no acquaintance is the main point here. So how do we explain the possibility of coming to understand a name in the absence of acquaintance? Is there a general explanation of how this works? So here I think it's worth thinking of the role of indefiniteness in thought. So Kripke, in the example of Feynman, stressed that someone who understands the name might be at best able to produce indefinite information about its bearer, a physicist or something. Just acquiring some indefinite information may constitute learning a name. Consider an example like this. So it's a dialogue. A says, "Who's this Professor Jones everyone is talking about?" And B responds, "He's a new hire in linguistics, one of several, very brilliant, apparently." So A now counts as understanding Professor Jones, despite not having been provided with definite information. Of course, he does have some definite information. Professor Jones is the person referred to by the name Professor Jones, or Professor Jones is the person we're talking about, or Professor Jones is the person to whom my interlocutor was referring. So we have some definite information, but but it's not the provision of that information that plays a critical role, because it isn't provided. The only thing that's provided is something indefinite. He's a new hire in linguistics. Well, indefinites can introduce definites, as one's familiar with from examples from Cartoonen from long, long ago. A man walked into the bar. He ordered a martini. We have no difficulty understanding the definite he. We could easily add a name in the second sentence. A man walked into the bar. Alfred, for so he was called, ordered a martini. And then we know the name Alfred. We've had nothing apart from the indefinite to introduce the definite. So it's nothing like acquaintance. Acquaintance just doesn't even begin to feature in the story. So in discourse representation theories, this phenomenon is registered by requiring the interpreter of an indefinite to introduce a definite mental expression, a discourse referent. So if you believe that, and it's tempting to believe it, there's a lot of data of which that is explanatory, then you're really thinking that the distinction between the definite and the indefinite is not fundamentally important. And that was made explicit by, again, going back a long time. This is going back to the late 70s and early 80s, that Irene Heim, the way she put it was that the difference between indefinite and definite is just to do with familiarity and stuff. It's not, there isn't really a semantic difference. From the point of view of the interpreter, you have to do the same thing when you encounter an indefinite as when you encounter a definite. So there's no sort of substantive semantic in the sort of old-fashioned sense difference here. Now, there's also something definite going on in normal cases, as I've mentioned. Because if you encounter a new name as used by your interlocutor, you also encounter something definite. The person my interlocutor referred to by the name. And that information, it seems to me, may play a critical role in enabling you to understand the new name. Because understanding the new name involves intending to join in the practice. I need to intend to use the name as my interlocutor used it. That's how you acquire understanding of a new name. It's through imitative intention. But to have an imitative intention, you need to have something to imitate. You're imitating your interlocutor, and you're presuming that your interlocutor does succeed in referring to something by the name that is hitherto unfamiliar to you. Your intention is to do likewise, to do what they did, what your interlocutor did. So the intention that you need to have is, I will use the name N to refer to the person my interlocutor referred to. So I think this is taking meaning is used seriously. One should think of learning as coming to understand, and understanding as knowing how to use. So the word-world relations that some traditional semantic theories focus on, they don't really play an essential role in explaining understanding. Knowledge how, rather than knowledge that, or knowledge of, is what's at issue. So that takes us a little nearer the kind of view that Ribot was encouraging us to hold. Learning to fence is learning how to do various things, much of it imitative, make a defense block, touch with the foil, and so on. So Ribot, if you remember from an early slide, said that learning a language was like learning to fence or learning to dance. Well, it's not terribly like it, but it's like it in this respect. It's learning a skill. It's learning how to do something. Learning a name is learning how to say various things, and imitation plays a crucial role in that. So imitation is actually quite an interesting notion, because to imitate, you have to bring the action that you're imitating under the right action type, under an appropriate action kind. So It's worth remembering the experiments with children in which they're asked to imitate an adult's action. And children from about the age of 4 will imitate the action that it was clear the model was trying to do. So if they drop something or bang into something, and that's clearly not part of what they were intending, very small children imitate by doing the right thing and not the wrong thing. They don't imitate the mistake. So that means they're identifying the action under a very specific action type, the intended action type. So it's interesting that we can, from an early age, can identify intended action types. And that extends to our ability to identify the action type that we intend to imitate when we imitate somebody else's use of a name, which is how we acquire many of our names. So a more common picture is not what I've said. It's that understanding is knowledge of word-world relations. But that faces the circularity problem already mentioned. To know that an element of X, say the words, is related to an element of Y, the things in the world, I need to be able to refer to both elements. But then, of course, if I can refer to Y, how do I do that? In order to acquire the knowledge that would constitute understanding of reference, I must already possess understanding of reference. I must already know some way of referentially thinking of Y, if I'm to come to know that a word refers to that object. So I was more in favor of the Rebo-like approach, which Russell seemed keen on in the analysis of mind, but which was certainly absent from a work even that came out even a couple of years before, the Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy. And one way to illustrate this is in our understanding of idioms, which we count as understanding, even though we don't know really how they're relating to the world. So think of the phrase 3 sheets to the wind, which is used to refer to someone whose walk is weaving and unsteady as a result of having had too much to drink. This is, I would surmise that the majority of those who use this idiom, including myself until a few days ago, have no idea really what it comes from or why they're using it. Or they don't have anything to say that would count as revealing their knowledge of word-world relations. Apparently, there was a kind of sailing ship in the 19th century which had the following property, that it became unstable if the wind lapsed from 3 of its sails. You don't have to know that in order to use the idiom completely successfully. And there are plenty of other examples. Once in a blue moon. Lots of people use this without knowing what a blue moon is, namely a second full moon in a month, which is something that happens only every 2 or 3 years. Or ace in the hole. People can know what that means without ever having played or even heard of stud poker. So our use is a practical skill, typically acquired by imitation. It's not propositional knowledge, though of course it may enable such knowledge. And in the same way, we can pick up the use of names very easily and without being able to provide some independent way of referring to their referent, other than in terms of our joining the practice. So all the information you get, like the subject of Kripke's example, who knew that Feynman was a famous physicist or something. The information might all be indefinite. It doesn't really constitute, it's not well, the mental state we're in is not well described as knowing a word-world relation. It's better described as having a skill. And that was the view that Russell adopted, kind of pretty much out of character in the analysis of mind. Well, unlike it's very unlike the principle of acquaintance. So this more behaviorist alternative has some explanatory value in my view. When you move away from the view that understanding is knowledge of word-world relations, it's much easier to see how understanding is possible and how it is often so very easy. I think of how kids learn language. They learn 15 or 20, 3-year-olds are learning 15 or 20 new words a day. And although we get less good at this as we get older, we still learn a huge number of new names every week, probably. I certainly learned some today, for example. It also explains how mistakes like Vulcan or phlogiston are not immediately discoverable as absence of meaning. If meaning was a word-world relation, then you should know from the get-go that Vulcan doesn't, the word Vulcan or the word phlogiston doesn't mean anything. And of course, fiction fits in very smoothly now and permits one to understand how it could be that one might understand a name without being sure whether it's fictional or not. So, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much to Professor Sainsbury, and everyone I'm sure joins me in applauding your work. And now it's time for questions, comments, rejoinders, reactions. First question from Professor Mendelovich. Angela, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for that. I guess it's a kind of foundational question, like what do we mean by understanding a language or terms in a language? Because somebody might agree that in many cases, all we have is the linguistic aptitude, the know-how. Somebody might agree that first you get the know-how, then you get, some more mental capacities concerning, word use. But do we, we might disagree on whether just the know-how counts as the understanding or whether there's something more to be had, beyond the know-how. So if you think that understanding would require something like, entertaining a content in your mind that you can reason and grasp with, then merely having the know-how, even if that's what, we mostly have, even if that's what we get first when we learn language, that might not constitute understanding. Or if you think that understanding requires knowing truth conditions or conditions for reference that something would have to meet to, to be the referent of a name, then again, you might think that just the know-how might not get you to that. So I'm wondering, do we have a kind of an antecedent way of thinking about what we're looking for, when we're looking for understanding, so that we can, so that we can assess whether this kind of behavioristic know-how will answer to that?
Well, I was assuming that we just had an intuitive notion of what understanding was, and that it's something that kids come to do and we come to do. And so I was thinking that someone who says that to understand is to know truth conditions is someone who's advancing a theory. They're not telling us what the notion of understanding that we initially use, or they're not really telling us how that works in a sort of non-theoretical way. They're bringing to bear a very specific kind of theory. And actually that particular theory has a special interest in this connection, because if you think of how it was used in Davidson's hands, knowing the truth conditions of the sentence "snow is white" is to know that it's true if and only if snow is white. And people have said, well, isn't that trivial or something? In my opinion, somewhat wrongly. But the point is this, that one can have a conception of knowing truth conditions which is extremely modest, or one can have a conception which is very demanding. Maybe one only understands snow is white. One knows that snow is related to water and cold in certain ways. But that, a very demanding understanding of that kind just wouldn't, it couldn't be an account of what it is to understand a language. I mean, children who know nothing about the composition of snow understand snow is white perfectly well. So, so I think my answer is that I was using a notion of understanding, which I regard as sort of pre-theoretical and pretty undemanding, but worth studying because joining a linguistic community is such an important event, or such an importance. It's so important in our development, but it's easy. And it can't be as hard as these more demanding theoretical accounts require, or else kids couldn't do it, but they do.
I mean, so would you disagree with the view that says when we join a linguistic community, first, in most cases, first we go through the motions. We learn the habits. It's like playing cricket. We become good at that. But then on that kind of scaffolding, we also acquire other mental abilities of entertaining contents corresponding to some of the terms and sentences in the language. Right. So like first we acquire the word, and then we get better at applying it, and then we kind of start understanding, or maybe I use that word, it might be under contention, but we start entertaining contents that kind of fill in what that word contributes to propositions of how the world might be like. Would you disagree with that? Would you say like all you've got is the linguistic behavior and dispositions, and then you don't have that further stuff?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the further stuff is going to be, but I think I probably don't think there's all that much to it. I think there are things you can come to appreciate about language, like scope distinctions, for example, which are often subsequent to having pretty good grasp of language. So that it's not that no improvement or no deeper understanding of language is possible. And of course, one can also, there's all sorts of stuff one can learn about the history of the words one uses in relation to other languages. And so that, I mean, there's plenty more to be found out, but I don't think this, I don't think that, I think the meaning of the word snow in a 4-year-old's mouth is exactly the same as the meaning of snow in my mouth, even though I could think some more sophisticated thoughts than the 4-year-old can. I'm still thinking sophisticated thoughts about which there's nothing more interesting to say in this regard than that they're about snow, using the word snow. So, I tend to feel that language is so omnipresent and so easy in a way that we need to be beware of building too much into what's involved in grasping it.
That's really helpful. It sounds like the alternative view to your own might agree that everything that you say is true, and then say, but there's more that can be achieved.
Well, there is a science of linguistics. I'm not trying to deny that, obviously.
There's more mental states that you can have going along with your language use. So there's more that you can have than just the mere linguistic dispositions. But we might still agree that entering a linguistic community, and interacting with others, that's largely based on just having the right linguistic dispositions, and that explains a lot of stuff. And maybe that comes first too. But somebody who disagrees might say, and there's more.
Right. Well, I think the way to, I can't disagree with that. But the way to pursue that dialogue would be to specify them more. And obviously that's not a straightforward task.
All right, thanks so much for the question and answer. And Professor Cargill, was that a follow-up?
I'd like the opportunity to preach my standard line again. And it seems a plausible formula that understanding the meaning is understanding the use, and understanding the use is knowing how to use it, and so on. And this is fine, but it can be set in overlooking Plato's insight that philosophy is dialogue. And in dialogue, it's not a matter of understanding the general use, it's understanding the use being made by the people you are talking with. And furthermore, the fact that it's a misuse is not going to make communication impossible. And rather than worrying about what various sentences mean, you ask what the people you're talking to mean by them. And you have Socrates saying, I want to find out what, if anything, you mean, Euthyphro, when you say that this is the pious thing, and so on. And this is immensely rewarding. It could be nice to know, I suppose, what could be meant, and then you could include that. But a fundamentally important thing anyway for philosophy is dialogue, in which the concern is with finding out what some person is saying, if anything. And that is different than this generalization. I've got nothing against the general project of understanding language meaning, and I see that good insightful things are being said about it, but it can obscure the importance of the Platonic insight that philosophy is dialogue.
I actually agree with everything you said. Yeah, I mean, that seems right to me. So I was talking about generalizations that you get when you fail to remember that it all begins in dialogue.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said too.
Oh, great. Harmony, yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. Our next question comes from, I apologize, Nikhil Mahant, and apologies if I'm saying that wrong. Nikhil is a PhD student at CU, if I'm not mistaken. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. I hope I am audible.
You are audible, yes.
Awesome. So, so I was wondering the extent to which some assumptions, the extent and importance of some assumptions in setting up the problem that you outlined, the idea that we can think of understanding in terms of, or by appeal to word relations. So the assumptions that I was thinking of are as follows. So one assumption is that a name stands for a unique object. A related assumption is that a name cannot be borne by more than one object. So unless we already assume that there is a direct relation between a name and an object, we can't even think of being acquainted with the object that the name refers to. And I think these are plausible assumptions because it doesn't really make sense to say what is Tom the name of, because Tom is a name borne by so many individuals. So my question concerns the extent to which these assumptions are important to set up the very debate. And if these are not plausible assumptions, what remains of the whole discourse? And what can we get out of it?
No, I take your point. So when you learn a name, what you learn is the name as used in the mouth of your interlocutor. This relates to Professor Cargill's point. Really, the starting point is that. So you achieve something which I agree is often overlooked, and which in your publications you've drawn attention to, which is the need to individuate names. Say which name you were talking about, and I agree that that's an issue. But in dialogue, it's resolved. It's the name as used in the mouth of that speaker. And then whatever the right individuation conditions are, you sort of get them for free, which isn't to say that you don't have your work cut out if you're a theorist trying to explain whether there are two names, David for David Hume and David Kaplan, or just one name or whatever. As a theorist, you have to do that. But as a user, it's sort of done for you by the imitation. You're imitating somebody who's using a name, and that's the name that that's the name using practice. It's the practice of using that name that you join when you learn it.
Can I follow up with another question? So I was a bit more curious about the notion of imitation here. So would you say, and I think you would say that if a speaker intends to refer to someone using a name, then the relevant notion of imitation would involve imitating this referential use. But if a speaker fails in referring to an individual because probably the name is an empty name or a fictional name or something of that sort, then the relevant notion of imitation would be, well, imitating this attempt at referring. If a speaker is using a name in other ways, for example, we can pluralize a name. So I know 5 Alfred, something like that. Then the relevant notion of imitation would be to use the name in this way in which general terms are used. Is that the idea here? The idea of imitation?
So, well, let's just keep to empty names. So somebody uses an empty name, and you want to join in that practice and use the name as that person did. So, of course, you don't know whether it's empty or non-empty, and we typically can't be completely certain whether a name is empty or non-empty, or whether someone's pulling our leg or is scientifically misinformed or whatever. So I see there is an issue there. So the issue is, does imitation consist in referring to that to which the speaker referred, which is an intention which might fail because the speaker didn't refer to anything? Or should we have an intention that's more cagey and is something like, well, what I'm going to do is to refer to what, if anything, the speaker referred to. So I'm not quite sure which is the best answer. I somehow feel the first is more realistic, even though it's sort of being cautious. And then what happens is that you fail to imitate because the speaker you're trying to imitate didn't refer, and you're trying to imitate that person, so you're not referring either. So yeah, no, I think that's the one that works out. So you succeed in imitating because you do what they did. You engage in an act of failed reference, but of course that's not how you see what you're doing in the typical case.
Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you so much for that. We're already in overtime, and I see Professor Costre has joined us. He's got the next talk, but I wonder if I can abuse my privilege as a chair and ask a very brief final question of my own. And the question would be this. I could very much follow the train of thought. I think the arguments are not good, but I still have the sense that Russell might have been onto something when he wanted to connect acquaintance with understanding what a name stands for, what a name refers to. So perhaps you're right that there are these demonstrative descriptions that are used to fix the reference of a name, if I understand correctly. So if I say a man walks into a bar, this particular fellow buys a martini or something like that. But still, I would need to have some way in which to properly use, to know how to use whatever the pronouns this expresses in the context there and then, and perhaps acquaintance might play a role there. It's not a...
It might, but it doesn't. I mean, you know, let me tell you, a man walked into the bar, he ordered a martini. So you say, oh, was it a vodka martini or a gin martini? Oh, well, let's think. I don't really know which he ordered. And we're still, you know, we've got the definite he. It doesn't stop us joining, you know, having a good talk about this guy.
Right.
So I'm just impressed by the what seems to me clear facts of linguistic interaction.
It would seem as though that would make for a perfectly competent language that somehow floats free of the world.
Yes, I quite like that. I think that, yeah, it may be that a fear, some sort of irrealist fear might animate the alternative view. Yeah, but as I'm not afraid of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Professor Mark Sainsbury.